The extension of the nervous system electronically means the end of privacy. The inconvenience of everybody being able to barge in on us by telephone. Double that inconvenience, treble it, with the inconveniences you can imagine for a future technology, where you would not only have the sound of the person's voice on the telephone, but also their visual image. It can be so worked out technically that everybody can be equipped with a little gadget about the size of a pocket watch. And everybody in the world who possesses one of these things has a number. And if you ring it and the number doesn't answer, your friend's dead.
Welcome back. That was Alan Watts discussing the future of privacy in 1971, so he certainly knew where we were heading. Now, in today's episode, we have Kee Jefferys, the technical co-founder of Session. Now, this is not a sponsored show, so I think you'll enjoy this hour-long discussion I had with Kee on the current state of Session, where it's heading in the future, and some of the technical details behind it. So without further delay, I introduce you to Kee Jefferys. Hi Kee, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you on the show. Now, before we dive into Session, can you just tell us a bit about yourself, your journey, and how you got into the world of privacy? It'd be good to hear your backstory.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I've been interested in computers from a really young age. And I think when I was 18 or 19, I decided to go to university and study computer science. So I was in my classes at the time. I think my lecturer mentioned in passing asymmetric encryption or kind of cryptography with public and private keys. And that concept really interested me. And at the same time, they kind of talked about how there were some interesting practical use cases of encryption. And one of those use cases was Bitcoin, which I think I found very interesting off the bat. And I kind of deep dived into the Bitcoin world at that point and started going to some local Bitcoin meetups. And I'd always kind of been interested in privacy preserving technology as well, because I think I'm a bit of a libertarian at heart. So
that's fine. You're among friends here then.
Yeah, exactly. The closer we can get to kind of creating free spaces on the internet where people can do what they want and not be censored by governments, I think the better. So we were kind of thinking at some of those meetups and talking to each other about how we could build or combine the incentive models of cryptocurrencies, which allow these massive public networks to start up and be incentivized. Like, for example, Bitcoin is the largest computing network in the entire world by far. It doesn't do very useful computations, but it does this hashing process, essentially. How could we kind of apply that model, which had given out these incentive and rewards to build these real world networks, and then combine that also with like the privacy preserving networks like Tor, and build a tool that was kind of uncensorable and create these free spaces online. So I think like that's a bit of the background kind of behind Session, is that it's kind of a combination between a bunch of different technologies to create a technology which allows people to be free and communicate with freedom.
Yeah, I love it. We were chatting earlier before the recording, and you were talking about some of the things you were working on. How busy is Session keeping you? And do you have time to unwind and do other things, or is this just taking over your life?
Honestly, it kind of comes in waves. And I'm not the only person that works on Session as well. There's people all around the world that work on Session and contribute and help out.
Yeah.
But there does tend to be kind of periods of more extreme work and then periods where you can take a bit of time off. So over the Christmas holidays, I actually got to take a bit more time off than I expected, which was good. Because I think like the past couple of holidays, like it's been a bit, you kind of go on holiday, but then you're working half the time type thing. But yeah, it kind of comes in waves. And I think that's probably the case with working on most tech things. Something explodes and you have to be online for a bunch of time to fix it. And then there's a long period where it's kind of, that there isn't as much going on.
Yeah, that's good to hear. I think my personality type, I'm not sure I would thrive. I have to solve things before I go to bed. And as a result, I can stay up to very late every night, which isn't always a good thing. So yeah, you have to balance these things. So I have to ask, and I always ask all my guests this first, before we dive into session and all the specifics there, could you just share a bit about your own journey with privacy? And you've already touched on this a little bit. And just to set some context, many of my listeners, they're deeply invested in their privacy setup. So many of them are starting to de-Google and using phones like Graphene OS, which I'm always banging on about, but it's something I think we should all be looking at. But there's a lot of listeners that maybe have just started and they're starting to perhaps abandon social media and get some control. But I think it's safe to say that every listener, they're all in favor of secure messaging. So if you're willing to share, can you walk us through some of your own personal privacy practices? Anything else you do outside of session that you do in your personal life?
Yeah, I think I've kind of gone through an interesting journey on this path. I don't know if you've kind of heard about the Dunning-Kruger effect.
I have indeed.
Yeah, you kind of have. I mean, if you look it up online, there's some people who kind of chart it out, and essentially, like when you get into a field, you feel like you're an expert in that field. You feel like you know everything that needs to be applied, like all of the privacy tools that I should use, and like how should I use them in my life. And I'm going to bring over all of my friends to these privacy tools as well. And then I think pretty quickly after that initial peak of optimism, you kind of enter this valley of despair, which is like, does it even matter? Like, it's so hard to get people onto these privacy tools, and then they just abandon them anyway to go back and use WhatsApp.
Yeah.
And you kind of enter this valley of despair where you're just kind of like, well, fuck this. Like, I'm going to give all my data up to the governments and like, who cares? And I think a lot of people are actually in that space now. Like, they've kind of tried out a few privacy tools and then they've kind of entered the valley of despair because it's so hard to get people over that hump. But then like after kind of the valley of despair, if you stay in the field for a while, you kind of get to that kind of, you start coming out of the valley, you start working out which tools you need to use in your life, like which tools are practical versus which tools are just kind of cryptographically secure, but not really practical to use because they have so many user experience deficiencies.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably where I'm out with privacy as well. Like being in the space for 7 or 8 years now, there are a bunch of tools that I do use. And then there's a bunch of like tools which I kind of consider impractical and would have kind of different protections in that space. So, I mean, like obviously I use encrypted messages every day. I use Tor. I use VPNs occasionally. Like I use Tor and VPNs occasionally, but I don't use them all the time because they tend to have user experience hiccups in terms of having to constantly complete captures and
you don't enjoy captures every 5 seconds.
Yeah, I don't enjoy proving that I'm not a bot every 5 seconds and websites treating me like a second-class citizen all the time. But yeah, I kind of use them situationally. It'll depend on the situation that I'm in where I use them. So if I'm in another country, for example, I might use a VPN to evade censorship in that country.
Yes, you touch on a really good point. And my tagline for the podcast is privacy doesn't have to be all or nothing. And that was really my way of responding to so many people that were giving up when they failed to achieve extreme levels of privacy. They can't be invisible, so they think, oh, well, I'll just give up on the whole thing. But surely that's better than just using Facebook, WhatsApp, TikTok, whatever else is going on these days.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's the thing, like a lot of people get very excited when they come into the privacy space and they try to get off every centralized service that they're using or every service that's collecting their data.
Yeah.
But then they quickly enter the valley of despair, which is, I actually do need some of these services. It's very hard to move my friends off some of these things. But it's better not to kind of enter that valley of despair and never come back. Like you want to kind of stay in the space for a bit longer and work out what is actually practical, because any improvement on your privacy is better than no improvement at all.
Yeah, definitely. I actually had a cousin contact me recently from the UK and she messaged me on LinkedIn. So I said, hey, look, here's my my number. Would you install Signal? You can message me much easier on there. But then she sent me a text message and probably had international rates as well. So not everyone seems to be open to secure messaging apps. But I was actually impressed by my mother, who's in her 70s, and I talked her through installing Session. Now, for context, she is not good with technology at all. Password managers, for example, would just blow her mind. So that was a win in my book. Have you managed to convince your friends and family to use Session?
Honestly, I'm not yet at the point where I'm recommending Session widely. And the reason for that is I don't think we've kind of gotten over every user experience hurdle that we need to. I think Session is a really good tool for particular threat models, especially threat models where, perhaps like the country that you're in requires a national identity to get access to a phone number, and you want to sign up for a messenger that doesn't use a phone number, or you are really concerned about leaking your IP address, for example, and Session naturally hides your IP address by using onion routing. So these kind of threat models, I think, are very interesting for Session to solve for, but I don't think Session is yet at the level of, say, Signal, where it feels extremely easy to use. And I think that's probably what the next year is about improving all of the features that are in Session, making calls bulletproof, making groups bulletproof in terms of their usability, because we've kind of handled a lot of the security side of things now. I think we're in a really good place there, but I think it's now just about pushing the UX as far as it can go. So I was glad to hear your story about your mum signing up and it all working well. But I probably haven't gotten to the point where, I'm asking all of my friends and family, or at least the older ones in the generation, to sign up for Session yet. But I think kind of towards the middle or end of this year, I think I will be.
I still wave that flag. And it's actually funny, when she was signing up and it asked her for a name, I said, just put your name. And she's like, oh, privacy. I said, no, it's fine. And it's great because she's obviously thinking privacy. I think I talk about it so much. It's at the forefront. But you mentioned something actually about the different threat models. And you may have heard, I think it was beginning of this year, a British journalist. This was in the UK. And I'm glad I got out of the UK, by the way. It's like George Orwell's 1984. They took it as the operating manual, to be honest. But did you hear this news of Richard Medhurst, who was the first reporter arrested under the Terrorism Act because he did not give the UK police, the passcode to his Graphene OS device? I think he had other mobile devices as well. Are you familiar with that story?
I'm not familiar with that story, although I have heard of very similar things happening in Australia as well. There were journalists who covered Australian commandos in the Iraq and Afghanistan war, and they were communicating with Australian military sources to kind of leak out information about operations that had gone wrong, or where Australian soldiers had overused force. And there was a similar thing that happened there. The Australian Federal Police raided the office of the biggest state media company, the ABC here, and tried to seize documents from that journalist and get access to their phone and their digital devices and all of that. So unfortunately, it's quite a common thing. And obviously the UK and Australia share a bit of history there as well. So,
they have their challenges.
Similar legal systems.
For sure. And I think in this case, he was using Graphene OS, was certainly on one of his devices, but he probably wasn't using the duress pin feature. And is that something Session supports? Can you add a pin code as like a secondary layer of authentication to access it and have a duress pin in case you have got the UK police asking you to unlock it?
We do support PIN codes, but we don't have a duress PIN code set up yet. But I think that could be really interesting.
Well, that's one of the reasons I use Graphene OS. And it's interesting. I don't have the same threat model as a journalist that's got contacts in Syria or Russia or places like that. But I like to practice what I preach. So I've set up my duress pin in Graphene. I probably will never need to use it because that is on the extreme end. But there's something also fun about knowing it's there. But also, honestly, this whole Orwellian future thing is concerning. There was the arrest of the Telegram founder last year as well. And I know Session has a very different operating model, but that, along with journalists getting arrested, is this something that concerns you as well?
Yeah, it's definitely something that concerns me from a global perspective. So, I think we used to kind of respect the fact that a journalist could publish something and you wouldn't target the journalists themselves for publishing that thing.
Yeah.
You would target the thing that they exposed. If they're exposing secrets about spying programs that national governments are running, in the case of Edward Snowden, the response should be to shut down those national spying programs that are, collecting millions and millions of citizens' data when they don't need to. The response instead was, okay, let's go after Edward Snowden for revealing this information, or let's go after the media organizations that publish this information, for example, in the case of WikiLeaks. So I think we're actually starting to see a similar thing happen in the sense of companies as well. So, Telegram publishes a messaging application. It's not end-to-end encrypted. It's centralized in its operation, but it still provides a service which a lot of, say, Russians and Ukrainians use to post information about the war that's going on there. It's used by a bunch of activists all around the world just because how user-friendly it is. And the response to that from governments isn't how can we kind of work with the people on the ground to improve Telegram's use. It's more, okay, let's go after the CEO who created Telegram and put political pressure on him, or put pressure on in terms of him going to prison, so that he complies with our request for user data. So it's really, the paradigm seems to be kind of shifting a bit under our feet. I'd say Session has quite a bit of difference from Telegram in the fact that there isn't a single kind of central person who works on Session, or a kind of CEO of Session. It's run by a non-for-profit foundation in Switzerland, and there's a bunch of contributors who work all around the world on Session, me being one of them. But there is no Session central servers which hold all of the user data. It's run on a decentralized network of nodes, and kind of your data is split up amongst those nodes. So even if someone comes to me, for example, and says, give us this data on a particular Session user, I don't even have access to that data. It's not just the fact that the data is encrypted, it's that I don't even have it at all.
Yeah, nothing you can do.
Yeah, the network is a kind of community-run network of nodes, so you would need to go to hundreds of different operators all around the world and get access to their databases to get the encrypted message, and then it's still encrypted. So you need to then compromise the keys of one of the devices. So, I mean, from that sense, Session is quite different. So it doesn't worry me too much, but I think it's a concerning development.
So we can get into more technical details in a moment, but I think you're going to move on to this, and that's phone numbers. And I know for me that the main point of avoiding phone numbers is, in most cases, unless using prepaid burner SIM cards paid for with cash, they're going to tie back to your real identity. And I think I've always thought that for people using the actual SIM card numbers that tie into messaging apps, they really do need to be careful, because sure, there's the metadata, it can identify them. But beyond that, if they lost that phone number, perhaps their cell phone contract expired, or someone did a SIM swap attack. I know there's some mitigations in place for that, but at least it gives an attacker access to new messages coming in. And in fact, talking about my mother in her 70s, when it comes up like safety number changed or something's happened, she has no idea what that means. So she would still believe it's me she's talking to. That's not the case with Session, is it? That's something you've obviously intentionally tried to avoid. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, correct. And I think, as you were saying with safety numbers, these are kind of examples of cryptographic protections, I would say, that aren't very practical in the real world. I mean, there was a usability study done on Signal a couple of years ago, which kind of gave Signal to a bunch of people people and ask them to verify whether they were talking to the right person or not. And they didn't give them much more direction beyond that point because, when people sign up for Signal, they're not, reading all of the docs necessarily, right? They're just signing up for Signal and trying to use it as if they would use any other messaging application. And what they found in that usability study was that nearly no one could understand how safety numbers worked. And it was very hard for the average person to verify who they were talking to. So, I mean, in that, the main reason that happens is because phone numbers are used as your identity in the case of Signal. So when you add someone on Signal, you're typically adding them via their phone number and their account is connected to their phone number. So there needs to be a lookup from that phone number to their public-private or their public key, which is actually the part that's used for encryption. And when that lookup happens, there is the threat of a man in the middle being involved there. So you look up that key and then someone in the middle, the Signal server, essentially responds with someone else's key for that phone number or their key for that phone number. And that's the reason that you need to have safety numbers, is because if the server replaces the public key that's associated with that phone number, they can essentially just pretend to be that person and you would never know unless you check the safety numbers kind of out of band. What Session does differently is it generates a public-private key pair when you sign up for Session, and that becomes your identity on the network. So we call it an account ID or a session ID. And basically you send that session ID to other people, and then they send you messages and encrypt it for that session ID. So there's no lookup which actually needs to happen. You use the user's session ID, which is this string of 66 characters and letters. It's basically a public key to actually encrypt the message. So you don't need to kind of map from a phone number to a public key because you have the public key directly. You just send messages to people. You don't need to verify the safety numbers. You don't need to do any of that. As long as you, got that session ID in a legitimate way, and you're messaging that session ID, which you can see in Session, you know that you're messaging the right person. And it can't change halfway through a conversation as well if the user's SIM card is compromised. And that's probably one of the biggest things as well, is like these SIM swapping attacks, where it's really hard to mitigate. You're basically relying on your cell phone provider to protect you against these attacks, because they ultimately have the ability to access all of your SMS messages and all of the verification codes that come when you sign up for a service. So if someone compromises your phone number, there's usually so many other things linked to that, including, say, your Signal account. Once they've got that, if you don't have a registration PIN, they can reset your account in some cases. And if you haven't been active for a certain amount of days as well, they can reset your account. So it's quite scary what people can do with your phone number these days.
Honestly, I'm completely with you when it comes down to the phone number being the identity. I think it's so antiquated. I'd even go as far as email. I hate email. I think it's an antiquated technology, and I have, I use Proton Mail and Simple Login, and I've got hundreds and hundreds of aliases. So my family just loves me. If I'm asked for what my email address is, I say, let me generate you one. And they think I'm crazy. But a great example is I can register a domain name, similar attack vector here. And I can enable email, do a catch-all. And if it's a domain name that's been around before, and you can look on expireddomains.net, suddenly I'm now getting emails that may have access to someone's Facebook account and goodness knows what else. But I see phone numbers in the same way, as they're recycled a lot, and it's opening you up for a threat. Even if your threat model, I'm not the journalist that has secret contacts all around the world, but at the same time, I work in cybersecurity, and I think it'd be pretty embarrassing if I had a SIM swap attack or someone got access to my messages because of a phone number that I thought I didn't need anymore, I've changed contract or what have you. Yeah, I think it's a genuine concern, but I think this alludes to the primary audience for Session. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I talked about my mother, people in their 70s. I'll guess that's not what you're anticipating yet to be the primary audience here.
Yeah, I think, if we were to kind of think about what the audience for Session looks like, I think it is kind of more on that extreme end right now. So people are looking for a very high privacy solution that protects their IP address, protects their metadata, doesn't require a phone number to sign up, has that strong sense of anonymity. Those are kind of the users that we're looking at now. And I think that's also part of the growth strategy for Session as well, is, we're at, I think, just above 1.1 million monthly active users right now. And I think like when we look at, how do we get Session out to more users, it's really hard to kind of go for the general messaging market first. So kind of competing with, say, Telegram or WhatsApp, these messaging applications that have 1 billion or 3.5 billion monthly active users, because you're trying to compete on a user experience level with an app that's been around for 10 years, 10 plus years, that has all of these features, that has compromised on privacy to deliver usability. So I think for us, when we're thinking about growth, we're thinking about the niche that we can kind of build. So like Session's niche is around that kind of hardcore privacy individual right now. I think that's, where we kind of grow up to 10 million monthly active users. And then it's about, okay, how do we kind of expand this to be a bit more like Signal in terms of, increasing the usability of all of the features in the application and kind of expanding to that user base, which is probably around 40, 50 million monthly active users. And then kind of jumping from there to the mass market, and kind of not compromising on privacy at each stage, but just like improving usability.
Do you see a future where corporations will start using secure messaging services? Because in my industry I'm in, I see ransomware attacks all the time, and they're primarily instigated because someone's received a phishing email, and emails can be guessed. It's first.last@company.com or whatever it is. There's text messages, and it just seems crazy to me that we see this so much. The enterprise, the big corporation, why are they not incorporating some of this? Because okay, they've got a very different threat model, but it's still a threat model. They're trying to stop being socially engineered and have their employees be more aware. Are you seeing any of that, or is that just something that's a very distant dream?
I think it's pretty, it's something that we've kind of heard about happening on the sidelines. So I've heard about a few kind of hospitals that are using Session for communication in hospitals. And then I know a few kind of doctor-patient scenarios where people are using it between their patients. But I think like the big thing with these messaging applications and using them in corporate environments is it's all around kind of compliance. So to use it in a health setting, for example, your messaging application needs to be HIPAA compliant, which is just a bunch of HIPAA is like an American standard for compliance for messaging applications, or for other software as well. But basically, like, it actually makes privacy in many ways harder to achieve, because you need to establish audit logs of everything that happens on individual devices, and those need to be held kind of in a location where an auditor can come in and say, okay, this device did this thing at this time. And actually, by creating such an audit log, you're creating a location where, if that audit log were to get hacked, you would get a lot of metadata about people that were using Session. So some of the kind of compliance measures that have been put in, I would say, go against privacy, which is unfortunate. So it may be one of those cases where it just kind of gets naturally adopted by people in the industry, but it doesn't kind of become compliant officially. Like a lot of people would be using WhatsApp in industries where they probably shouldn't, but because WhatsApp is so usable, people just use it everywhere. So it's one of those things where I think if we can boost the usability high enough, like, we just will see some of that natural adoption, whether Session is compliant or not. And then, the risk is put on the user who's using that application in that context. But we may look into some, other compliance measures as well. Maybe it would be interesting to release like a kind of commercialized version of Session, which is separate from the main application, which is able to meet those bars, but doesn't compromise on the average user's security.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny, actually. I had an experience the other day. I won't mention the company name, but I had to email them some photos as attachments. And I always strip metadata out of pictures. I have an EXIF remover, do all that, optimize them, sent them on. For whatever reason, they couldn't open them. But the guy responded and said, it's okay. I forwarded them to my personal Gmail account. I could see them there. This is, unfortunately, it's a small company, but this is what I see time and time again. It's lack of training as well for the end user. And I don't know, maybe I'm being too adventurous, but I just would love to see the end of phone numbers and email addresses and I love the session ID. In fact, when my mother saw that, I said, right, you got to memorize that. And I was joking. She went, I can't remember that. That's the point. You don't need to. Like, when was the last time you typed an email address? You don't. You just type my name and it comes up. So yeah. I think we're getting there.
Yeah, totally. I think we're not there fully yet. If you were to ask me kind of 10 years ago whether I thought people would still regularly be using email, I probably would have told you no. But, people still do very regularly use email. If you ask me that same question now, will people still be using email in 10 years? The answer is probably still yes, unfortunately. Where we're moving towards, I think, end-to-end encrypted messages. Like these days, most people for work and kind of home usage, communicating with their family, they are using a messaging application rather than SMS or email, which is good. Like it's a movement in the right direction, but there is still a lot of fallback that's going on. Like, people still do use SMS with people that they talk to rarely, or they still use email in a work context when something needs to be kind of formal and given notice. So I think we're slowly going to see those things fade away, but it's not going to be for quite some time where we get off, emails and phone numbers completely. And I'm concerned to the level at which a lot of the modern technology that we rely upon, like instant messaging, is connected to legacy systems like phone numbers and email addresses. It's like we're kind of half getting away from these things.
Yeah. And one thing actually I'd like to bring up, and it'd be good to get your opinions on, is operational security, or OPSEC. And I don't think it's a big as topic as it should be in the privacy community. And for me, for example, if someone compromises my phone, then it does not matter what end-to-end encryption I have going on, because now they've got the potential to access everything, which is why I like Graphene OS. But that also leads to things like usernames. I think people need to be really careful here, because I think their ego often takes hold, and then they pick usernames that ultimately tie back to their identity. And we talked a bit about recovery and phone numbers, but from an operational security standpoint, is there anything you want to talk about there?
Yeah, I think like what you touched on there is important as well. I mean, people need to consider their own threat models as well. Like, if you're a journalist talking to sources in, Afghanistan or something, you have a different threat model than someone who's just trying to protect their communications from corporate surveillance, for example. So those cases are different, and how you design your operational security system then ends up being different. But all of the stuff you kind of talked about is like using different usernames on different services so that different services can't be tied together publicly, considering what would happen if your phone were to be seized by some sort of state authority and they were able to get access to your device. What would that result in if you were to be compromised? Like, is there ways to kind of remotely delete your data off your device, or is there ways to kind of have a decoy account that you're able to give them access to, but then your real account remains hidden? Like, these are all kind of interesting questions to consider depending on what your threat model is.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so while you're talking, I've just opened up oxen.observer. I don't know if that's an official URL, but it says there are 2,279 active session nodes. So while I'm looking at that, I'm thinking, okay, could you explain to my listeners more the technical aspects of how session works? Because we haven't really covered that yet. I've got so many questions, but I'll let you just speak to that if that's okay.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, like when we talk about session, and its comparison to other messaging applications, typically talk about like three differences between Session and, say, Signal.
Yeah.
So the first difference is Session doesn't require a phone number to sign up. You just generate this key pair and you can start sending messages on the network. The second is that Session uses a decentralized network to store and route messages instead of a central network. It doesn't have a central server the way that Signal or Telegram does. And the third is that Session uses onion routing as well. So instead of sending messages directly from myself to the server, we're sending it to a decentralized network of nodes, and then we're also kind of putting a bunch of different hops, which kind of act as mini VPNs, if you will, between you and the server that you're communicating with, or the node in the network that you're communicating with. So the way that node network works is that there is around 2,200 nodes that are operated all around the world. And those nodes can be operated either in data centers as VPSs or on home computers, Raspberry Pis, if you will. Those nodes are operated by hundreds of operators all around the world. So there's a bunch of different operators, and they get rewarded for doing that in a cryptocurrency. So they get a little reward every kind of couple or every month, right? They can kind of withdraw it every month, and that incentivizes their operation. And then they're also kind of have to put up a bit of a stake to run one of those nodes as well. So if they perform poorly, they can be kind of removed from the network, and there can be a punishment there as well. So there's both an incentive and a punishment for that decentralized network. And then when you send a message on Session, what you're doing is you're actually calculating what is called a swarm. So every user on Session has their own swarm, and the swarm is 5 to 7 nodes out of that network of 2,000 nodes. And when you send a message to me, you look at my Session ID, you calculate the swarm deterministically from that, and then you deposit a message in my swarm. And then when I come online, I go to my swarm, I ask it for the new messages for me, and then they'll send back those encrypted messages for me. The important thing here is that a lot of systems that have been designed in the past for messaging are directly peer-to-peer. So both users need to be online at the same time to message each other. Whereas in the case of Session, you can actually be offline for a period of 14 days. And your kind of swarm will store that message in a redundant way so that when you come back online, you can grab that message back. And also, like in that system as well, instead of talking directly to any node in a swarm, you actually create this onion route as well, which hides your IP address when you use Session 2. So a lot of terms there, but hopefully that's like a bit of an overview of how the system works.
Yeah. So the swarm, is that the same? So when I look at Session now, I like the fact that I can see the onion routing, that I can see, I'm going through Germany and all over the place. So the swarm is separate from that. And what happens if a node goes offline in that swarm?
Yeah. So your swarm is separate from your route or your onion route through the network. So you have a path through the network, which is basically like 3 random nodes that you've selected in the network, and you use onion routing to hop between those nodes. And then the swarm will be the recipient, so the person you're talking to will have 5 to 7 nodes in their swarm. And basically you tell one of those nodes, or you can tell several of those nodes about the new message that you're sending to that user. And you also have your own swarm as well. So when someone sends a message to you, they're sending a message to the nodes in your swarm. What happens if a node goes offline? Essentially, what is happening there is when you send a message on Session, you may be sending that message to one of the nodes in that user's swarm, and then that node replicates the message across the other 5 to 7 nodes, or 4 to 7 nodes in this case. So they receive the message and then they send it to everyone else in the swarm. So if one node goes offline, the message is still replicated, say 6 other times or 5 other times. And you can just stop talking to that node that went offline and just ask another node, okay, what are the messages for me? So in that way, because the network does change a lot and nodes can go offline and online, that means that we can still kind of preserve a sense of continuity in the messaging application, you don't just lose all of your messages when a single node goes offline.
Interesting. So I was up late last night digging into this. Oh, by the way, I love the light paper. I'll link to that in the show notes because I think it's a really good read. I also like the photocopy effect on the styling. I thought that was a nice touch. Now, I was reading your blog as well, and you mentioned that key generation uses 128 bits of entropy instead of 256. And I believe you were responding to someone who was challenging this. And by the way, I also saw a discussion on Stack Exchange, unrelated, but I think relevant. And someone said, anybody who claims to know what computers will be able to do in more than 50 years from now is either a prophet, a madman, a liar, or all of the above. And I thought that was actually a good response. So could you talk about that for a moment? And also, can you explain the reasoning behind a 13-word mnemonic seed phrase and the security all this provides?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, this would probably be something that people are somewhat familiar with if they've ever used their own cryptocurrency wallet before. So, if they've ever used a Bitcoin wallet before, typically the process there, if you own your own keys for your wallet, is that you generate a private key, and then for that private key, you get a seed phrase or a mnemonic phrase, which is 12 or 13 or 24 or 25 words, depending on the amount of entropy that is created and whether there's a checksum in the amount of words. And then that becomes what you kind of write down on a piece of paper, or that you kind of store in your password manager, depending on your threat model. You back that up, and then if you lose access to your phone, or your phone is destroyed, or your desktop device is destroyed, you can then use those 12, 13, 24, 25 words to recover your access to your account. So Session works in a very similar way to that, where you kind of generate this public-private key pair, which is your identity on the network. And then from that, you can derive all of the other key pairs that you use in Session. And then the private key behind that identity on Session is stored as this 13-word recovery phrase, so that if you lose access to your phone or your phone dies, you can still restore access to your Session account. Or if you're linking another device as well, you can also share that seed phrase with another device, so that it can also get access to your messages as well. If you want to have, say a device on desktop and then also a device on your phone that are linked together with the same account. So I think, recently we had a security researcher look into all of these systems and propose that there was a flaw in this design. I think, since they've since kind of retracted a lot of their initial claims about the security of the system, and they kind of wrote 2 blog posts and they were quite sensational, and then kind of had to roll back a lot of their claims over the following 7 days. So that's been an interesting experience because, we've kind of had to look into these things and confirm whether they were, serious or not, and then write up a response and respond to that person. The kind of sad thing is that a lot of people, like, the initial blog posts were very sensational and were kind of saying, Session has these critical vulnerabilities and you can break into someone's account, with way less work than you would typically expect from, a secure seed. And people kind of read that, and we hadn't responded at that point because, it had come out like 12 hours ago, and we were still kind of looking through and verifying things and making sure that we were right in our response. But people read that and just kind of assumed, Session is bad and I shouldn't use it, without kind of verifying that themselves. And then, it was 48 hours later or a couple of days later where we published our response, kind of, saying, no, Session doesn't really have these issues and this is the actual case. But at that point, people aren't going to read the responses as much as they're going to read the initial article. So I hope not too many people have gotten the wrong idea about, the security of Session by just reading the initial post that guy made.
So you alluded to this earlier as well. So how does Session make money? And you talked about, the incentives behind running a node. And actually, by the way, before we get onto the making money piece, you said about a Raspberry Pi, so I'm assuming then to run a node, it's not very resource intensive. So could I run it on, say, a virtual machine in DigitalOcean or something like that? Is there anything stopping me from doing that?
Yeah, definitely. There are actually a lot of nodes hosted in DigitalOcean right now as VPSs. And yeah, the requirements aren't very high, which is good because, you know, a lot of the other kind of blockchain networks or kind of cryptocurrency networks have quite high resource usage because they are kind of dealing with different types of data. But when you think about session, what a service node or what a session node is actually doing on the network is it's storing a portion of the messages for the entire network. But because we have these swarms and there's five to seven nodes in a swarm, and there's 2,000 nodes, you're probably only going to end up storing, you know, one 330th
Oh, wow.
of the network's total data. And every 14 days, there's a rotating queue of deletion. So you only ever hold kind of 1/330th of the network's data for 14 days, and then you're kind of clearing that out progressively. So once a message becomes 14 days old, it gets deleted, and then a new message may come in, and there's just like a rotating queue that's happening there. So the storage requirements are actually really low. It's mostly a bandwidth thing, but because messages are fairly small as well, like the bandwidth that's used isn't very high, and the computation to deal with, the amount of messages that are stored on the network, which I think is around like 100 million or something like that per 14 days, it just isn't very high. So you can end up running these nodes on a very low spec computers. We recommend, I think, 4 gig of RAM, more than 40 gig of storage, and 10 megabit up and down on the connection. I think that's enough for a node in session.
So then what's the incentive behind that? So let's talk about that. It's like a cryptocurrency I can earn?
Yeah, so like we're actually in the process of like kind of transitioning the cryptocurrency right now. So there was previously a coin called Oxen, and basically you would buy a bunch of that Oxen off the market. You would stake that when you run a node. So if people are familiar with the idea of staking in Ethereum to run an Ethereum validator, it's quite similar to that process. So you stake an amount of cryptocurrency to this node, and then by providing service to the network, by routing and storing users' messages and validating users' messages, you receive a reward, which is paid out in Oxen as well. That's how the network currently operates. We're moving to session token. So that's going to be the new name of the token. And there's a whole migration process which is happening for that now. It's basically just to make the process of staking and earning rewards a lot easier. But yeah, like that's kind of the basic idea behind the model. And as I was kind of talking in the intro, I think cryptocurrencies, a lot of people have very negative initial view on cryptocurrencies. Like they think that they're all kind of scam coins, or maybe they believe in Bitcoin, but everything else is a scam coin. And I think like to a certain extent, that has been true. Like there has been a lot of kind of scam projects out there that get people investing a lot of money and then run away with the money. For us, I think like that's like when the company was initially started, we just saw how you could build kind of these physical infrastructure networks with this incentive model. You can build these community operated networks, but then that they, if you don't require some sort of financial stake, they become easier to Sybil attack. So you see stuff like that happening with Tor, where because anyone can run a Tor node, you kind of see this thing that happens where potentially governments could be running a large amount of Tor nodes, or malicious actors could be running a large amount of Tor nodes. And if your entry point and your exit point from the network are run by the same node, then it kind of actually like reduces your anonymity in the system to essentially nothing. So by having this system where people actually need to put up a financial stake in the system provided through the cryptocurrency, it limits the amount of kind of nodes that a single person can run, because the financial stake just becomes so extraordinarily high to run many of those nodes in the network. And then there's also this kind of downside that you can provide to nodes that operate poorly in the network by slashing the amount of cryptocurrency that they had. and essentially imposing a financial cost on them. Instead of the case in Tor, where if someone is proven to be operating poorly on the network, well, they can just delete all of their nodes and then come back the next day, set up another 1,000 nodes, and now they've regained their anonymity. Whereas in the case of Oxen or Session, if those nodes are slashed, then they've incurred a significant financial cost at that point. They would need to recapitalize themselves to run more nodes in the network. So it kind of offers some interesting properties in that way. It's not aimed to completely solve the problem, because obviously there are extremely well-funded attackers in the space that could potentially overcome that initial financial burden. But it is designed to kind of minimize these attacks and then at least provide a way to recover the network in the case of those attacks.
Because you've had issues, haven't you? I heard you mention this actually on another podcast where I think you were saying, was it Russia have blocked your service nodes? They're trying to ban Session. Are you running into that in other countries?
Yeah, that's another massive kind of issue, which is I could talk about for hours as well.
I've got time if you have.
Yeah, which is censorship evasion, which essentially we have this decentralized network of nodes, which people use to connect with Session, and people use onion routing as well to route through these nodes. But those nodes are fairly public, and they don't churn all that often. So there isn't essentially nodes that are joining the network and nodes that are leaving the network every day. It's kind of more like 2 to 3% per month would churn in and churn out. And what that basically means is that if a state level attacker gets all of the IP addresses of those decentralized network of nodes, and then in their firewall, their national firewall, they just block access to all of those nodes on the network, then essentially you've denied service to Session users, because they can no longer connect to the service node network or the Session node network, and they can no longer kind of send messages. So there's a lot of interesting thoughts about how to get around that, and Tor faces the same issue in many ways as well, because they have around 7,000 or 8,000 community operated nodes in the network, and national governments do the same thing as well. They just get they get a list of all of the Tor nodes or all of the Tor relays, and then they just block access to them, so that you can no longer or Tor guards more specifically, they just block access to them, and then you can no longer connect to the Tor network. So they've kind of established this system of bridges, and they have this thing called Snowflake, and there's a bunch of other kind of interesting tools which you can use to get around that. But it is a very interesting problem at the core as well.
Yeah, this definitely sounds like a rabbit hole we could go down. It's concerning, really, the whole censorship piece of this, because I've heard this with DNS even as well. Is that something you're actively working towards trying to mitigate against? Or is that really something you're just thinking we can't do much about it?
No, I think we're quite interested in whether we can implement mitigating tools. I mean, there are a bunch of technologies which look quite promising, which VPN companies use typically. So, the reason that a lot of people are able to communicate out of China to the worldwide internet, not the kind of blocked version of the internet, is because they use a VPN in China. And typically the way that those VPNs work right now is that they use a technology called domain fronting. So what domain fronting does is that it typically uses a CDN. So you have these CDNs like Cloudflare or Fastly or Akamai. Basically, all of these services are set up to cache, websites or different content in different areas, so that if you're in China and you look up, some unblocked service, that you're loading that content from the CDN instead of a service in the US, which would be much slower from a latency perspective. But what you can actually do is, because the request is typically going to the CDN itself first, even though to someone who's sniffing all of the packets on the network, it looks like it's going to the website. So like when you look up, I'm trying to think of a service. Like if you look up facebook.com or something, the request is going to look like it's going to Facebook, but it's probably going to a CDN first. And that CDN is then, routing it to some other location where the request can be served or serving it themselves. So what you do in domain fronting is you kind of signal to the CDN when they're processing the initial request that actually you want to go to a different destination rather than what you're claiming to go to in the encrypted or in the packet itself. So instead of going to facebook.com, you ask the CDN to send you to like Tor, and then the CDN will route that request to Tor and then deliver you back the response. But to the to the sensor person who's watching all of your internet traffic, it just looks like you're communicating with a CDN. And it just looks like you're requesting data for, say, facebook.com.
Of course, if they try and block that, they're screwed because they're going to potentially block everything else.
That's the main advantage of domain fronting, is because you're kind of, I wouldn't say exploiting, but kind of using something, using one of these CDNs in an unintended way. If they want to block the requests altogether, they need to block access to the entire CDN. And these CDNs are typically very highly centralized and serving many, many websites. So it's not just, maybe you could do the same thing with Facebook or something, like, if you routed to Facebook and then they routed to some other thing and they gave you back the response. But then they just need to block Facebook. Whereas if you do it with a CDN, now they need to block like thousands and thousands of websites, which has an economic impact on their country. So they need to consider whether they want to do that or they just allow these things to go through. Then typically, like, the way that you're using domain fronting is that not all of the data that you're trying to route goes through the domain fronting because it's quite expensive from a bandwidth perspective. But you may use this to then distribute a list of nodes which are unblocked to a service like or a VPN client in the country. And then you're just talking about rotating those nodes often enough and delivering that new list via domain fronting to the VPN client. So you're kind of using, multiple techniques together. And that's a very interesting approach for session as well. And I think that's probably the route that, looks most promising to me when I look at the problem.
Interesting. Something you haven't mentioned yet is Session Pro. And I've got a note here to talk about it. Is this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is this where funds are put into like a pool and it helps pay for this new session token network? Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think you asked like how does session make money before, and this is the long-term strategy. I would say like that has been communicated down by the Session Technology Foundation and what the developers are following right now. The idea being that most users are going to use Session for free. They'll sign up for an account, and that might be 98 or 99% of users that use Session in that way. But there's always going to be a user base of users who are interested in more premium features. So, for example, the ability to store larger files on the network, or to kind of have custom like profiles or custom usernames or profile customizability. All of those things are quite interesting to power users of a service. So the idea with Session Pro is that essentially you kind of capture value from these premium users, and that value is then put into the session token, and that session token goes into a pool which pays out rewards to the network for operating the nodes that ultimately handle not only the blockchain aspect of things, but also like message verification and routing as well. So kind of it's kind of a similar idea to, say, Telegram Premium, which is a subscription service that you pay for, and it offers you better features on Telegram, but represented in kind of a decentralized way, where it's the node network which is benefiting from that value that people are paying into Session Pro. So that doesn't exist right now. We're working on it, and we're kind of in the process of transitioning the network right now. But that is kind of the future sustainability model for Session.
How far away are we from that?
Look, I'd say like right now we're just focused on migrating from Oxen to Session Token, which is a big migration for us. We're hoping to kind of get that out in the next couple months. And then it's like after that, like once everything's migrated, we'll look at kind of where Pro fits in the picture and that monetization system as well. So yeah, I can't give you a hard timeline, but I can give you kind of a list of things that need to happen first, which is primarily the migration needs to happen first.
And I've got to ask this, if whenever that's available, if someone goes to Session Pro, there's no risk of the de-anonymization, I guess, unless they put in their username Fred from New York Times or something ridiculous. Everything else is still, is it going to give them more, or is it the same anonymization but just more, like you said, large file attachments and so on?
Yeah, I think like we the way that we've always thought about Session Pro is that it's cosmetic and kind of file size upgrades and stuff like that, improves speed, but not that it provides you any more anonymity features or privacy features. That the base level of privacy or anonymity would be provided in Session to all users, regardless of whether they had a Pro subscription or not. So it's more about kind of convenience and usability that Pro would provide, if someone was really pushing Session to its limits, but not that we would say like, oh, you get more privacy if you use Session Pro.
And I was actually thinking more the other way around. Like, let's say they got the ability to add some username that could identify them, or how do you pay for Session Pro? If there's like for me in the US, a US dollar amount somewhere, could that then be traced to identify me, or are you putting measures in to prevent that from happening?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, I think the way that we're thinking about payments for Session Pro is that, to get Session Pro, you need to interact with, there'll be a cryptocurrency payment which needs to occur on chain to a pool, which basically or gives an amount or burns an amount of tokens that then, are given to the kind of nodes that run the network, in a roundabout way. But that there would be kind of a bunch of different third-party payment providers. So, maybe someone offers a system where you can buy Session Pro with a credit card, and obviously that's going to be more traceable than someone who offers a payments gateway where you can buy, Session Pro with a cash payment in the mail, or where you could buy Session Pro with an anonymous
now we're talking.
So like it's kind of, the idea is that Session Pro is provided in a decentralized way, and that X thing needs to happen on chain, and that's not private, but then people can set up their own kind of gateways to process those payments that happen on chain in whatever way they want, and then they can charge a bit of premium in between. So maybe if you buy Session using a cash payment in the mail, maybe that's a 10% premium by someone else who's going to do the transaction on your behalf, but at least it kind of creates this separation at that level. So that's kind of broadly speaking the idea. And then I think like there's quite a few interesting things that we could do with like blinded tokens or zero knowledge proofs on the blockchain side to connect that with your Session account as well, so that there isn't kind of a tracing between the on-chain transaction and your access to Session Pro. So certainly something that's in the top of our mind in terms of like when we're thinking about the Session Pro design.
So can you share any exciting updates or new initiatives? Anything you can share with my listeners on what they can expect next from Session?
Yeah. So I think like, we've made a lot of interesting, or there has been a lot of interesting developments over the last couple of months. So Session has moved to Switzerland, essentially. So there's a Session Technology Foundation, which is set up in Switzerland. And that's the organization which makes all of the decisions about the long-term direction of Session and holds funds to, give to different developers that are working all around the world on Session. So that's a very interesting development from our side. I would say the direction that they've set out is really that the next 12 months will be about improving sessions usability. So focusing on features like calls and notifications and groups, and just making these things as rock solid as possible. So, when you send a message on session, that the person on the other end always gets a notification about when that message arrives. Or, when you make a small group with 5 to 10 users, that group is 100% reliable. And even if users go offline for more than 30 days or delete their device and recover their device, that they'll still be able to rejoin that group and send messages. These are, I think, a lot of the things that Session has struggled with absolute reliability on over the past, I think Session's been out since 2020, so over the past 5 years. And I think this year will really be about kind of getting the basic features of Session into a super reliable state. Because I think a lot, over the last couple of years, we've been focused on kind of building out the network and getting kind of more esoteric features in that are interesting to people who are very privacy minded. But now I think it's about just focusing on the core value proposition of Session, which is to be able to send messages to other users and for those users to get notified when they receive those messages and to be able to do phone calls really reliably. And I think focusing on that over the next year is going to be really important. So we're improving calls at the moment. We have an update to groups that is going out probably in the next month or so, which is going to, massively improve the experience for groups. And then we're also going to look into notifications as well and make those as good as possible. So, those are kind of the things that we're kind of thinking about.
It's great. And honestly, I do get emails from listeners. It's not it's not a large percentage of listeners, but very high risk individuals that I know this is a very good fit for them because they are high risk. And I obviously can't reveal why, but this is exactly, I think, what they're going to be interested in. But for everyone else that's, interested in Session or wants to support your mission, what's the best way for them to get started or involved?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends in kind of what way they want to get involved. But if you want to just try out Session, Session is on every single platform, so iOS, Android, desktop, for Linux, Mac, and Windows. And we, on our website, getsession.org, we have access to APKs, executables, IPAs, basically any way you can think of installing Session, we've probably got it. So if you want to try out Session, feel free to download the application and just send a message to one of your friends, or you can send a message to me as well. I have my ID published all over the internet, so if you just look me up, you'll be able to find my account ID or Session ID.
Kee, that's great. Is there anything else you want to share with the listeners before we finish this episode?
Maybe just reiterate my initial point, which is it can, at least for the people who are getting into privacy for the first time, you can, have this feeling of overwhelming empowerment, which is very good. But then a couple of months later, once you've tried to kind of transition all your friends and you're using all of these private applications, but you're having usability issues, you can enter that valley of despair. So I would just say when you do enter that valley of despair, know that on the other side, there is a way that you can kind of use tools in different ways to get much more privacy, but still, have that user experience of all of the applications that you like to use and that make your life better. So don't despair too much if after a couple of months, you're in a worse place than when you started, because it will get better.
Yeah, I love it. Well, I'm going to get my grandparents on board next, and I'll let you know how that goes.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Well, thank you for that, Kee. This has been a fascinating conversation. We've gone well past the hour, so we'll end it there. So thanks again for coming on to the show.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on, Ray.
So that was Kee Jefferys, the technical co-founder at Session. You can follow them at session_app on X or go to getsession.org. Now, I do want to take a moment to thank all of the supporters again at Patreon. That's patreon.com/the lockdown. You are the reason that I can keep this show free of ads and sponsorships. That discussion was just a casual conversation. It was not sponsored, and for that, I appreciate the support. As always, if you have any questions or feedback for the show, you can reach me at lockdownpodcast@protonmail.com. Talk soon.